When we picture the Middle Ages, we imagine a world wrapped in velvet and steel. We see pious monks, kings ruling by divine right, and gleaming knights charging into battle for honor and chivalry. The historical record reveals a brutal transactional reality. In a world with few safety nets, every scrap of land, title, and daily meal carried a steep, ongoing cost. The true currencies of this era were extreme physical endurance and elaborate social theater. Survival required the trade of one's body, while power was maintained through performance. To survive freezing winters, secure spiritual salvation, or maintain a crown, we must examine the specific trades they made in blood, sweat, and silver. At the lowest tier of the social ladder, peasant laborers possessed exactly one asset: their own capacity to endure physical misery. Take the gong farmer, who spent his nights waist-deep in collapsing cesspits hauling human waste. Or the fuller, whose entire career involved standing barefoot in vats of stale human urine, stomping raw wool for hours until the ammonia finally softened the fibers. The leech collector serves as the ultimate example of this bodily trade. To supply the booming medical demand for bloodletting, these workers waded into stagnant bogs, stood perfectly still, and used their own bare legs as bait to harvest leeches. For the peasant class, extreme physical suffering served as the literal baseline currency required for survival. That transactional brutality scaled all the way up to geopolitical warfare. The island geography of 9th century Paris made the capital particularly vulnerable to a naval blockade. When Ragnar Lothbrok arrived in 845 with a fleet of dragon-headed warships, he utilized weaponized psychological terror. He mass-executed and crucified captured Frankish soldiers in full view of the city walls, breaking the defenders' morale before a single ladder was raised. Watching his capital starve and his relief armies get ambushed in the mud, King Charles the Bald pivoted to economic surrender to save his crown. The ransom was staggering. This visualization shows the physical mass, 2.5 tons of silver bullion, that bankrupted the region. Ragnar's success provided a template for economic warfare. Viking leaders replicated his tactics, transforming raids into business-like extortion that forced cities to stockpile treasure. This economy of physical toll even extended to the afterlife. The medieval church taught that absolution required literal, agonizing movement across the continent. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles on foot, carrying almost nothing. They faced certain starvation and severe blisters, plus constant bandit attacks, all to reach a distant holy site. At grand, heavily funded shrines like Santiago de Compostela, authentic suffering met commercial theater. Relic vendors, innkeepers, and monks operated highly profitable tourist hubs, selling blessings, amulets, and pardons to the exhausted travelers who had survived the road. The elite class found ways to circumvent the physical toll. Wealthy lords often hired proxies to endure the muddy, dangerous walk on their behalf, or simply purchased pilgrimage badges at the local market to skip the journey entirely. By assigning physical miles to spiritual forgiveness, the medieval church transformed abstract faith into a measurable, transactional industry built on pain and silver. Even inherited noble titles required active, physical validation through the tournament. The lists were a zone of raw carnage. Knights charged at 30 miles an hour with 12-foot wooden poles, routinely walking away with shattered ribs and severe concussions, while competing against opponents who often cheated by reinforcing their lances with metal cores. This extreme danger was wrapped in deliberate pageantry. Knights utilized heraldry, exotic silks, and custom armor to court the attention of watching nobles, turning battlefield skills into a tool for securing political alliances and wealthy marriages. For these knights, shedding their own blood within a choreographed performance was the investment required to purchase and maintain their social status. Whether a peasant in a cesspit, a king paying a ransom, or a knight in the lists, the medieval world demanded a visceral, physical toll for every inch of advancement. The tactical use of terror shifted geopolitical borders across the continent. These massive payouts eventually transitioned into land grants, allowing Norsemen to carve out territories like Normandy directly from the Frankish Empire. The gleaming crowns and towering stone cathedrals of the Middle Ages stand as monuments to human endurance. They are the physical remains of a world where every status symbol and spiritual blessing was purchased through a visceral exchange of suffering. We usually view the people of the past as simple, stoic figures trapped in the stillness of history books. But cracking the marble reveals a much more restless reality. Pre-modern life was defined by a permanent state of low-energy panic. When survival hinges on the unpredictable, ordinary events take on terrifying weight. A minor sneeze, a misplaced shoe, or a quiet room signaled an active threat from the void. These bizarre historical superstitions functioned as evolved psychological defenses. They were the tools used to manage the sheer terror of existence in an era where logic offered no protection. Looking closely at these strange habits reveals a hidden architecture of human resilience, a system designed to maintain sanity in a world governed by chaos. A medieval peasant relied entirely on a few critical possessions. Losing a single patched leather shoe invited frostbite and the potential end of a livelihood. In winter, an exposed foot wasn't a nuisance, it was a life-threatening disaster. This absolute dependence forced an intimate, almost conversational relationship with objects. Peasants named their shovels and cursed broken ovens as if they were uncooperative coworkers. Anthropomorphizing a tool provided a healthy way to process the exhaustion of survival, focusing one's anger on a plow rather than the void. The Roman Empire attempted to scale this control across continents. They transformed the labor of viticulture into an imperial system of order, settling veterans on conquered hillsides to ensure the landscape itself reflected Roman discipline. This obsession with order extended to the dinner table. Romans treated diluted wine as a mandatory moral test of self-mastery. Mixing water with their drink served as a public demonstration that they could enjoy the empire's abundance without surrendering to chaotic impulses. Whether it involved whispering to a rusted blade or meticulously watering down a vintage, manipulating the physical world was humanity's first line of defense against an unpredictable environment. Physical survival meant little without social permanence. In a world without records or photography, the threat of being forgotten was a form of erasure. If your name vanished from the community's memory, you effectively never existed. Because literacy remained a rare privilege for the elite, the masses turned to visual proof. Illiterate peasants used unique, legally binding symbols to confirm their identity on contracts. These personal marks transformed abstract promises into a tangible social reality. In Tudor England, this need for social validation moved to the body itself. Beauty functioned as a grueling political currency. A woman's appearance, her pale skin, rigid posture, and silence served as public evidence of her moral reliability and her family status. This rigid system created a lethal paradox. Women poisoned themselves with lead-based cosmetics to achieve a mandated, natural purity. They constantly risked their physical health to hide the visible flaws or aging that would lead to immediate social ruin. Managing a social identity was a mandatory survival tactic. A scratched symbol on a contract or a toxic painted face provided the only protection against being discarded by society. The unseen world posed the greatest anxiety. Medieval people viewed a silent house as an active threat, signaling death or a demonic presence. They intentionally filled their homes with talking, singing, and the shuffling of tools, specifically to push back the spiritual void. Even a reflexive sneeze triggered a spiritual crisis. A theological belief held that this brief moment of lost control left the soul unguarded. The immediate blessing functioned as a protective seal, slammed shut before the invisible could take advantage. This constant urge to negotiate with the unseen eventually reached a massive geopolitical scale at the Isthmian Games in Corinth. These important games served as a high-stakes negotiation with Poseidon. Corinth relied heavily on the sea for its wealth, and the entire city converged to appease his volatile nature, hoping to trade athletic excellence for safe, prosperous harbors. The resulting competition was brutal. The broken bones and blood spilled in the dirt served as calculated physical sacrifices. The athletes endured this intense suffering to earn the divine favor that a single city-state could not survive without. The unseen world required extreme measures. From a frantic blessing over a sneeze to the violence of the stadium, these rituals maintained the fragile illusion of safety. Our ancestors were not foolish. They were resilient improvisers building psychological armor. Every strange rule was a stone in a wall built to keep the chaos of the world at bay. Today, we market absolute silence as a luxury, paying for retreats and noise-canceling headphones. It's a striking reversal for a species that spent centuries fearing the quiet as the void. We should look at our own modern, logical rituals with the same scrutiny. In 1,000 years, our daily habits might look like the same desperate coping mechanisms we see in the medieval peasant. The rules of survival have changed, but our instinct to build an architecture against anxiety remains eternal. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden logic of history. For 3,000 years, the Odyssey has been defined by a single image: Odysseus struggling against a violent sea to reclaim a stolen throne. This version of the story focuses on a warrior defeating mythological beasts, while his wife, Penelope, waits passively for 20 years at her loom. But this narrative is a byproduct of 3 millennia of oral tradition and translation. Each retelling has added layers of polish, potentially obscuring the original mechanics of the myth. To find the reality beneath the epic, we must look at how these archetypes were constructed, specifically the secret contracts that actually stopped the hero, the investigation led by his wife, and the manufactured monsters. These legends served as cultural tools. They were less about recording events and more about projecting specific ideals, even when that required ignoring the facts of the story. The traditional text blames the gods for the hero's 20-year delay. Odysseus spends a decade fighting at Troy, then a second decade drifting between the Lotus Eaters, the Sirens, and Calypso's island. While the suitors focused on her weaving, Penelope was cross-referencing the Ithacan diplomatic archives. She was hunting for the specific reason her husband was being denied a return. She discovered a private journal with entries predating the war. It referenced a secret oath Odysseus made to secure favorable winds to Troy, but the final lines detailing the cost of that oath had been violently redacted. Penelope traveled to a forgotten shrine in the east, eventually forcing a confrontation with a primordial sea goddess. The deity was still waiting for the payment Odysseus promised in exchange for his safe passage to the war. Penelope's defense was built on logic rather than luck. She argued that since the sea had unilaterally held Odysseus captive, it had violated the terms of the original bargain, invalidating the goddess's claim on his life. By legally dismantling a divine contract, Penelope moved the resolution of the Odyssey from the battlefield to the courtroom. She proved that the king's return was made possible not by his own spear, but by the queen's intellect. This shifts our perspective on the hero's physical triumphs, most notably the blinding of the Cyclops, Polyphemus. There is another side to this encounter, involving Brontes, the brother of the blinded giant. Brontes was a shepherd who traveled to the mainland to see why humans were so committed to the idea of his brother's savagery. Brontes found an elderly farmer with a broken wagon and lifted the cart with a single hand to repair the axle. But when he later approached a human city, he was met with a mob. The citizens saw his size and immediately responded with stones. A wandering poet named Demades later explained the situation to him. The problem wasn't what Brontes did, it was how stories are sold. This diagram illustrates the funnel of audience demand. A complex, neutral entity enters, but the audience wants a villain. Over time, actual details are smoothed away. The story repeats until the original person becomes a simplified caricature, justifying the hero's violence. In this context, the Cyclops isn't a biological monster, but a narrative one, a character reshaped to fit the specific needs of a storyteller. Odysseus finally returns to Ithaca and uses his legendary bow to slaughter the suitors, reclaiming his throne through a calculated, bloody purge of the palace. It's a classic heroic ending, but it ignores the hidden mechanics we've just uncovered. A king whose delay was caused by his own secret debt, and a queen who had already logically secured his release. To maintain the legend, the storytellers had to bury the hero's mistakes. The oath that cost Odysseus his entire crew is minimized to keep the focus on his resilience. These retellings also prioritize physical dominance over silent, strategic intervention. Penelope's active defense is framed as passive waiting, ensuring the cultural spotlight stays on the violence of the king. The real Odyssey isn't found in the miles sailed across the sea. It's found by looking through 3,000 years of narrative polish to find the specific, human compromises hidden beneath the myth. Your morning routine is likely an exercise in casual convenience. You stumble out of bed, pour some coffee, and perhaps nod to a neighbor. But for much of history, these same actions, waking up, eating, and greeting a stranger, were executed with the precision of a stage play. Early societies relied on order to prevent collapse. To manage the chaos of survival, they developed rigid theatrical rituals, disguising their legal codes and defense tactics as daily habits. From the imperial tea rooms of China to the grand arenas of Spain, we find a shared history where living and performing were effectively the same thing. In these cultures, a missed cue or a forgotten line carried immediate consequences. Failing to follow the script resulted in social exile, the loss of freedom, or death. Within the Forbidden City, the morning began in near total darkness. Long before the sun reached these roofs, imperial concubines were awakened by attendants whose sole job was to manufacture an image of perfection before the first light hit the courtyard. Physical perfection functioned as a baseline requirement for political survival. Maintaining favor among dozens of watchful rivals demanded that every jewel and hairpins be flawlessly placed. A single aesthetic flaw provided the opening for a rival to orchestrate your permanent disgrace. The breakfast table served as a psychological combat zone. Eating portions were policed and posture was strictly observed. Every casual compliment about a colleague's hair was a measured trap designed to test an opponent's composure and standing. After breakfast, the concubines performed the ritual of being seen. They glided through the gardens with a highly calculated grace, projecting enough relevance to alert the emperor's spies without appearing desperate for his attention. For these women, domestic life was a bloodless war zone. Authenticity was a liability, and a flawless performance was the only available shield. In the decentralized landscape of medieval Ireland, a traveler on the road was completely vulnerable. Without inns or safe highways, survival depended entirely on the hospitality of strangers. The Brehon laws codified this welcome into a strict legal obligation. Every free person was bound by these ancient statutes to provide food, shelter, and basic protection to any traveler who crossed their threshold. To protect the host's own resources, the law established the 3 nights rule. For exactly 3 days, a host provided food and a warm hearth. At the dawn of the 4th day, the traveler's legal right to shelter vanished, and they were expected to move on. The risk of failing this performance was both legal and supernatural. A host who neglected a traveling poet might suffer a satirical curse, a public poem that functioned as a legal brand, ruining their honor and standing in the community. Irish hospitality operated as a rigid social infrastructure, using mandated performance to hold a fractured, stateless society together. In Edo period Japan, performance moved into the streets. Kabuki theater was born on riverbanks, offering rowdy, subversive entertainment to a growing class of merchants and townspeople. The ruling shogunate viewed this energy as a threat to public order, repeatedly banning performers and forcing the art form to evolve to survive. When women and boys were barred from the stage, Kabuki reinvented itself with an adult male cast. To navigate strict censorship, actors developed the visual language of kumadori makeup. These exaggerated colors encoded character traits directly onto the face. Red signaled heroism and virtue, while blue identified supernatural villains or political traitors. These rigid visual rules turned the theater into a coded space where the public could perform rebellion right in front of the government censors. Spain's version of this public stage was the Plaza de Toros. This architecture was designed specifically to magnify a single, high-stakes duel, placing thousands of witnesses around a perfect circle of sand. The event evolved from Roman gladiatorial echoes and Moorish horseback displays into a localized street dare. What began as a chaotic test of nerves eventually moved from the cobbled streets into these formalized arenas. The professional matador replaced brute force with a highly choreographed ballet. The focus shifted from a bloody brawl to an exercise in precise footwork and calculated bravery, where the fighter's posture was as important as his survival. The bullfight became a place where raw terror and the forces of nature were transformed into a controlled, beautiful performance of national identity. Across these 4 worlds, theatrical requirements dictated the terms of survival. Whether in a roaring Spanish arena or a quiet Chinese tea room, the public performance became the primary filter for social and legal reality. These historical rituals served as the essential mechanisms for enforcing morality and managing the inherent chaos of human nature. We no longer risk social exile for a messy hairstyle or a satirical curse, but our daily routines remain a high-stakes performance. The settings have modernized, but we continue to navigate our world through the remnants of these ancient survival scripts. We tend to measure the strength of ancient empires by the sharpness of their steel and the size of their armies. We picture legions marching across continents, assuming that force alone kept the world in line. Conquest is the act of creating a vacancy in the halls of power. To fill that void and hold land permanently, a leader must master a set of mechanics that continue to function long after the soldiers go home. Today, we are looking past the battlefields to uncover the specific systems of control. We'll examine the relentless physical infrastructure of Rome, the managed perceptions of Cleopatra's Egypt, the legal scaffolding of Empress Theodora's Byzantium, and the cold administrative machine of the Teutonic Knights. These leaders understood a quiet truth of history. The most effective way to rule a population is to master the invisible engines of daily life. When Rome expanded, it replaced temporary military garrisons with unyielding logistical dominance. They specialized in engineering projects that made imperial control feel like a fact of nature. Their first tool was permanence, made possible by opus cementitium, a self-healing concrete mixed with volcanic ash and seawater. This material allowed them to pour indestructible structures, like the unreinforced dome of the Pantheon, which remains intact 2,000 years after the last Roman mason walked away. Next, they mastered gravity. Roman engineers calculated precise angles to build aqueducts that transported millions of gallons of fresh water across deep valleys and straight into the heart of their cities, using zero moving parts. And to connect it all, they laid down 250,000 miles of military-grade paved roads, like the unbroken path of the Via Appia. These routes made the movement of legions and information predictable and fast. Roman engineering actively reshaped the landscape to suit imperial needs. They tunneled through mountains and redirected rivers to demonstrate that their will was absolute. Every straight road and steady flow of water communicated a specific message to the local population. The empire's presence was permanent and inescapable. In the East, power resided in the management of perception. Cleopatra of Egypt used visual spectacle as a political weapon, turning public appearances into calculated displays of divinity. She staged grand public displays, like arriving on a gold-plated barge or crowning her children as the new heirs of the East. She minted her profile alongside Mark Antony on silver coins, projecting a unified, wealthy image that demanded Roman respect. Across the Mediterranean, Octavian realized he could use those same displays to destroy her. He commissioned imposing marble statues of himself dressed in military armor, styling himself as a disciplined, traditional Roman to contrast with Cleopatra's foreign luxury. Octavian's propaganda campaign successfully reframed Mark Antony as a man who had abandoned Roman virtue for an Egyptian queen. By the time their fleets met at the Battle of Actium, Antony's reputation was already ruined, leading directly to mass defections and a total military collapse. Cleopatra used the theater of power to build a formidable coalition, but Octavian proved that the same narratives used to elevate an empire can be flipped to dismantle it. In the Byzantine Empire, Empress Theodora secured power from the inside out. She wasn't born into royalty. Her early life was spent navigating the gritty, chaotic world of entertainers and animal trainers near the obelisks of Constantinople's Hippodrome. When the devastating Nika revolt threatened to topple the empire, the emperor's council urged him to flee. Instead, Theodora refused to run, commanding her generals to trap and crush rioters in the same Hippodrome Plaza where she grew up. With her authority absolute, she immediately began rewriting the Byzantine legal code. She instituted aggressive protections for vulnerable women, clamped down on forced prostitution, and granted women the right to inherit and own property. At the same time, she quietly championed the marginalized Monophysite Christian sect, hiding exiled monks in her palace and building a loyal intelligence network independent of the emperor's control. Theodora realized that a crown is a fragile asset. By reshaping the moral and legal framework of her society, she built an internal base of power that proved more difficult to breach than any stone wall. Sometimes the engine of control is pure administration. In the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights marched into the Baltic frontier, combining holy zeal with cold, calculating efficiency. They systematically converted pagan lands into a massive corporate monastic state. The order operated on precise paperwork, relentless taxation, and an unyielding chain of command, where even minor infractions were met with severe punishment. This obsession with order was stamped into the earth itself. They constructed a massive network of intimidating, geometrically perfect red brick fortresses, like the sprawling Malbork Castle, dominating the landscape and enforcing their absolute rule. However, their administrative machine eventually became a vulnerability. Their bureaucratic zealotry and refusal to adapt to shifting political alliances in Eastern Europe blinded them, leading to a catastrophic collapse at the Battle of Grunwald. Bureaucracy is an effective tool for rapid expansion and resource management, but when a system becomes entirely inflexible, it is destined to shatter under its own weight. Every single one of these physical regimes eventually fell. Rome was sacked by barbarians, Cleopatra took her own life as Octavian's troops closed in, Theodora succumbed to illness, and the Teutonic state was eventually stripped of its holy mandate and secularized. Yet, while the emperors and queens vanished into the dust, the non-military systems they engineered managed to survive the collapse of their creators. This chart compares the finite lifespans of these states with the persistence of their methods. Roman engineering defined urban planning for 2 millennia. Byzantine law codes shaped modern legal systems. Octavian's media strategies are mirrored in current political cycles, and the Teutonic bureaucracy provided the administrative blueprint for the Prussian state. The swords, the shields, and the battlefield victories fade quickly from the map. True historical power belongs to the architects, the lawmakers, and the storytellers who built the systems we still live inside today. History is usually presented as a series of loud collisions, swords clashing, empires falling, and kings shouting commands. But when the noise of the public square fades, a different kind of war emerges, a quiet one, fought in the shadows. Authority has a hidden side. If you are entirely removed from the battlefield, if you have no legions to command, and no voice that anyone is legally obligated to hear, how do you exert your will? Civilization was frequently guided from the spaces no one else was allowed to enter. Inside imperial palaces and sacred temples, the course of nations was determined by subtle social maneuvers, calculated chemical threats, and highly guarded rituals. Controlling a kingdom often came down to mastering the private sphere and ruthlessly dictating exactly who was permitted to step inside. In feudal Japan, a concubine's mourning began with a grueling, highly choreographed ritual. Every motion was scrutinized by attendants, and simply rising from a futon required perfectly executed grace. It was a daily exercise in survival. Preparation was a form of physical erasure. Attendants applied a thick layer of white powder, often made from toxic lead, to mask all natural expression. Heavy silk robes and an incredibly tight obi sash restricted breathing and turned every step into a calculated strain. Within the women's quarters, influence was won through the timing of a glance and the precision of a false compliment. A single polite observation about a peer's calligraphy could dismantle her status and end her summons to the daimyo's chamber. Once dressed, the concubine sat perfectly motionless in a minimalist tatami room, projecting an aura of serene mystery. Her entire standing in the palace depended on the possibility of a summons that evening, yet she had to appear entirely detached from the result. In this environment, influence was never seized through direct action. Power was achieved through weaponized stillness and the cultivation of mystery. Rulers faced a constant challenge: how to eliminate a popular internal rival without sparking a public civil war. Cleopatra viewed toxicology as a necessary political science. She used her laboratory to test venoms on prisoners, documenting exactly which toxins killed quickly and which left no physical trace. In Rome, the intimacy of a shared meal provided the ultimate trap. The vulnerability of eating and drinking on shared couches with supposed allies gave paranoid emperors the perfect opportunity to strike. Emperor Claudius was killed by his favorite dish of mushrooms. The assassination was orchestrated by professional poisoners who understood that a quiet death in a dining hall left no witnesses and fewer questions. Legends of the Vishakanyas describe women fed toxins from a young age until their saliva became lethal, turning a lover's kiss into a planned execution. Poison bypassed military strength and fortified walls entirely. It exploited human biology and the inescapable trust required to share a meal or a bed. Because the private sphere held so much wealth and danger,
ancient societies engineered ways to physically restrict who could cross their thresholds. Mesopotamians relied on cylinder seals to secure their rooms. Rolling a personalized seal across wet clay created a physical mark of identity. If the impression remained intact, the contents were safe. The Egyptians advanced this with the wooden pin tumbler lock. Vertical pegs dropped into a sliding bolt. To open it, a key's pegs had to align exactly with the hidden tumblers, lifting the pins out, or the bolt remained trapped. Romans miniaturized these designs into durable bronze and iron. They often wore their keys as rings, signaling their elite status as property owners to everyone they met. In ancient China, security became an intellectual puzzle. Artisans developed compact trick padlocks with deceptive angles and hidden springs to safeguard scholars' calligraphy and intellectual secrets. These keys functioned as heavy, physical manifestations of authority. Carrying one signaled exactly who held the right to cross the threshold. Ancient people also used physical intimacy to attempt to speak directly to the gods, crossing the final boundary between the human and the divine. In Babylon, sexuality functioned as a public, institutional duty. Temple rituals were designed to invoke cosmic order and guarantee the fertility of the kingdom's soil. Within certain tantric traditions of India, physical union was a structured ritual. By merging spiritual opposites, practitioners sought to reach a state of divine enlightenment. In these sacred spaces, the ultimate private act was stripped of its secrecy to wield divine influence over the world. A wooden pin dropping into a lock, a precisely measured toxin in a golden cup, a heavily powdered face in a silent room. Public wars occupied the record books, but the lasting boundaries of society were frequently drawn in these private chambers. The battlefield conquers territory, but the private world remains the ultimate source of human power. It is here that we decide who we allow inside and who we lock away.
You open your eyes. It is pitch black. Your bed is a literal slab of rock, doing nothing to accommodate your spine. The air is so cold you can see your breath. And outside the cave, everything with a pulse is either hungry, sharp, or faster than you. Breakfast is not a guaranteed daily ritual. It is a whispered prayer to an uncaring sky. To eat, you have to dig, scrape, scavenge, or sprint after an animal, and hope it is dumber than you are. The hunger here is the kind where your stomach starts having hostile conversations with itself. You pick up a piece of flint. In this world, tools are not decorations. That razor-sharp edge you painstakingly knock into the stone is the reason anyone has teeth left. It is your only real defense, and your only method of processing whatever scraps of meat you manage to drag back to the fire. Your tribe does not care about your inner thoughts or your sparkling personality. Social status is measured by one metric: immediate physical usefulness. Can you hunt? Can you weave a trap? Can you stay quiet when an insect crawls up your leg? If you fail these tests, you become a temporary, highly flammable guest. For hundreds of thousands of years, this brutal math was the entirety of the human experience. But eventually, we secured our physical survival. And the moment we stopped worrying about freezing to death in the dark, we began inventing complex cultures, strict loyalties, and lofty values, ideals that would inevitably clash with the violent reality of the world we actually live in. Take our relationship with the predators that used to hunt us. Instead of simply fighting off the terrifying creatures in the shadows, ancient civilizations did something peculiar. They began treating them as divine protectors. In ancient Egypt, a cat roaming through a granary was treated as an untouchable manifestation of the divine. The goddess Bastet was the feline deity of home and cosmic protection, and the animals themselves were worshipped as living guardians of that sacred balance. The culture built an entire industry around this reverence. Priests bred cats in massive temple complexes,
ritually sacrificed them, and then intricately wrapped them in resins and perfumes so they could serve in the afterlife. They applied the exact same logic to the Nile crocodile. The average villager lived in daily terror of being dragged into the muddy water, yet they built massive temples to the crocodile god Sobek. They weren't trying to tame the danger. They were honoring the brutal side of nature. Elevating these predators was an early attempt to impose spiritual order onto chaos. If a crocodile was a god, then its violence had a purpose. It was a beautiful illusion, a way to make the uncaring environment feel like it followed rules. By the Edo period in Japan, the rules humans invented had become far more rigid. Here, the strict legal statutes of the shogun collided violently with the ancient, unyielding warrior code of Bushido. When Lord Asano was unjustly ordered to commit ritual suicide, his chief retainer, Oishi, and 46 other samurai were cast out as masterless ronin. They didn't draw their swords in a blind rage. Instead, they spent over a year living in the streets, projecting the perfect image of disgraced failure to lower their enemy's guard. On a snowy night in 1703, that disguise dropped. The ronin breached the mansion of the court official who caused their lord's death. They moved with absolute, rehearsed precision, sparing the innocent and executing their target. This was a measured, sacred duty. They didn't try to escape. They marched the severed head through the streets of Edo, placed it before their lord's grave at Sengakuji Temple, and calmly awaited their fate. They knew exactly what the law demanded. The shogunate allowed them to commit ritual suicide, cementing their legend forever. The 47 ronin achieved perfect moral justice according to their ideals, but doing so required them to become state criminals and willingly pay with their own lives. A few decades later, the American experiment produced a man who designed both the physical and philosophical architecture of a new republic. Thomas Jefferson was obsessed with Enlightenment reason, symmetry, and logic. He authored the boldest political claim of his era, the idea that human equality is a natural, inherent right, completely untethered from kings or bloodlines. But the man charting this map of universal liberty was writing from Monticello, a mountaintop plantation powered entirely by the forced labor of over 600 enslaved human beings. He kept detailed records of their monetary value while publicly calling slavery a hideous blot. His capacity to compartmentalize was staggering. He used to use that same authority to dismantle the system of bondage that paid his debts. He stands as the peak of human contradiction. He possessed a mind capable of outlining the blueprints of human freedom, while his daily life relied on profound, systemic cruelty. From a shivering human napping flint in a cave, to warriors dying for a masterless code, to a philosopher writing about freedom on a slave plantation, we are looking at one continuous story. The ideals we invent to elevate ourselves above simple survival are incredibly powerful. Our myths, our laws, and our philosophies build civilizations, but they also create our most dangerous blind spots. History rarely offers a clean, upward trajectory of moral progress. Instead, it is a messy, constant negotiation between the unforgiving realities of the world we actually inhabit and the beautiful, impossible ideals we refuse to let go of. We imagine the medieval era as chivalrous knights and clean castles. The reality was built on splintering wood, freezing snow, and spilled wine. The global landscape of civilization didn't evolve through polite diplomacy. It was forged by uncompromising survival and two radically opposed philosophies of how to control human beings. In the East, an empire built on perpetual motion and ruthless efficiency. In the West, an empire built on static control, religious uniformity, and strict social hierarchy. To understand how the modern world was actually drawn, we have to look past the royal decrees. We have to zoom in on the mud, the cold and the grueling daily reality of how these people lived, ate, and fought. You wake up somewhere near the Annan River on the Asian steppe. The temperature is bone-deep cold, and personal space does not exist. You sleep pressed directly against your horse, its body heat your only reliable life support system. Breakfast is a survival test. You drink arog, a sour, fermented mare's milk that burns on the way down. You chew rock-hard dried dairy curds and gray, leathery mutton that takes 20 minutes to soften. This brutal conditioning created a military doctrine stripped of romance. No grand speeches, just speed, extreme pragmatism, and continuous, terrifying movement. Look at this image of a steppe warrior. Arrows were fired backward while the horse remained at a full gallop. This mechanic allowed for the famous feigned retreat, letting them lure in and dismantle larger, static armies that couldn't match their pace. To their enemies, it looked like barbarian chaos. Beneath the surface, it was a fiercely intelligent logistics network. The Mongols figured out how to govern millions without tying themselves down to a single piece of geography. These massive wooden wheels allowed an entire command center to be packed up in hours. By mobilizing their government, the Mongols remained immune to traditional sieges while governing millions from the saddle. This map shows the result of that mobile efficiency. Follow these red dotted lines. Those are protected, complex trade routes. Because the Mongols were constantly in motion, they could secure thousands of miles of roads and establish lightning-fast postal systems almost overnight. Their genius lay in creating a culture of supreme adaptability. By mastering frictionless efficiency, they forcibly connected the disparate parts of the medieval world. Step out of the freezing wind of the steppe and into a European Great Hall. The environment immediately becomes claustrophobic, thick with the smell of roasting boar and imported spices. A feast here was a political machine. Where you sat and whether you were served a stuffed peacock communicated your rank. This social theater ensured that every noble knew exactly where they stood in the eyes of the crown. Charlemagne translated this need for social order into a blueprint for governance. To rule a fractured continent, he moved past tribal loyalties and replaced them with a rigid, institutional machinery. This standardized script, Carolingian minuscule, was the literal glue of that machinery. It ensured that his laws and instructions were identical from France to Germany, enforced by traveling auditors who inspected every local lord. The immense scale and weight of the Selikas like this one represent the final layer of control. By tying administrative power to divine right, Charlemagne created an ideological monolith that made his static order feel inevitable. While the Mongols conquered through fluid motion, Charlemagne forged a continent by building an immovable hierarchy where every citizen was anchored to a specific rank and place. Far from the yurts of the East and the cathedrals of Europe, the North Atlantic offered a different kind of proving ground. Here, Leif Erikson was caught between his father's violent pagan heritage and the expanding reach of Christian order. This is a Viking longship. Notice the sweeping wooden curves and the shallow draft. By combining this maritime engineering with raw survival endurance, Erikson pushed past the very edges of the known map. This landscape marks Vinland, his North American settlement. Centuries before Columbus, Erikson built homes in this timber-rich land. But look at the vast distance surrounding these structures. Erikson realized the logistics of supplying an ocean outpost, combined with native resistance, made the settlement unsustainable. He proved that a journey to a new continent was possible, but his defining legacy is one of profound strategic restraint. He recognized that true leadership sometimes requires walking away from a conquest you cannot hold. History tends to smooth out its uncomfortable edges. We remember the Mongols as chaotic destroyers, ignoring their administrative genius. We hail Charlemagne as a holy unifier, looking past the extreme brutality required to enforce his bureaucracy. At their core, these were two entirely opposing systems. On one side, a horizontal network that prioritized motion and trade. On the other, a rigid pyramid that forced stability, top-down authority. These systems provided the tools for our modern world. Mongol efficiency created the first continental-scale postal and trade networks, while Charlemagne's clerks established the administrative and legal standards that define Western government. Our modern landscape of commerce and law is the direct result of these two brilliant, brutal cultures colliding.
We complain today when a dating app glitches or a message goes unread. But for much of history, survival was a matter of navigating narrow, high-stakes constraints. A single misplaced word could trigger a blood feud. A poorly timed glance could end a career. How did people endure the immense stress of love, surveillance, and war without the safety nets of the modern world? To navigate the pressures of existence, humanity built complex psychological fortifications. We invented rigid rituals, physical disguises, and uncompromising honor codes to act as anchors when our environments became unpredictable. This is the architecture of human resilience. By examining 4 pillars, love, society, war, and death, across 4 historical extremes, we can see how people engineered their way through the most suffocating eras of our past. In medieval Europe, courtship was a reputational minefield monitored by the church. Holding eye contact for too long could result in a lawsuit for breach of promise, while open displays of lust invited public excommunication. Lovers survived this surveillance by communicating in a hidden language. They created a system of plausible deniability, concealing their actual intentions within the specific, widely understood meanings of flowers. Take a look at this botanical data logic. Combining columbine, which represented foolishness, with carnations for fascination, allowed a suitor to deliver a complex romantic message that appeared as a harmless gift to any passing priest. If flowers weren't available, suitors relied on even narrower gestures, like complimenting a woman's shoes. Because the church forbid admiring the body, focusing on footwear allowed a man to signal interest without crossing a legal or religious line. It shows that even under total religious and social suffocation, humans will find a way to encode their emotions into the objects around them just to keep their relationships alive. In the civic realm, the Republic of Venice faced a different kind of pressure. This was a society defined by an inflexible class hierarchy and a government that relied on a massive network of secret informants. The city's response was the Bauta mask. This eerie white mask featured a jutting jaw that allowed the wearer to eat and talk while remaining anonymous. It was actually mandated by law during certain government votes to ensure that even the most powerful nobles couldn't be intimidated or bribed. For women, the ritual of disguise was even more restrictive. They wore the moretta, a black velvet mask with no straps. It was held in place by a small button gripped between the teeth, making it impossible for the wearer to speak while masked. The moretta created a strange shield, granting high-status women the ability to move through public spaces without being identified, but the price of that freedom was literal silence. The Venetian Carnival wasn't just a party, it was a release valve. These masks allowed citizens to briefly shed their inescapable social identities and survive in a city that was always watching. In 19th century Japan, the human experience was defined by the violent collapse of an era. As foreign powers forced the country to open its borders, the old feudal order began to crumble under the weight of rapid modernization. Standing against this tide were the Shinsengumi, a samurai police force in Kyoto. They were the last defenders of the Tokugawa shogunate, desperately fighting to uphold a system that the rest of the world was quickly leaving behind. This photograph shows the Shinsengumi grouped around a map, still defined by their traditional swords and armor. They were becoming relics in real time, facing an imperial enemy that had already transitioned to Western rifles and artillery.
Compare that traditionalism to the image of Emperor Meiji in a full Western military uniform. The new government didn't just want to win the war. They eventually abolished the samurai class entirely and banned the public wearing of swords. When their very existence as a social class was being erased, the Shinsengumi used the Bushido Code as a psychological anchor. They chose to fight to the end in the north, preferring a warrior's death to a life where their identity no longer existed. Finally, we arrive at the ultimate unknown, mortality, and the fear of total erasure. To the Vikings, death was a physical journey that required a massive investment of resources. This excavation of a buried ship proves the lengths they went to, sending their dead off in a vessel designed to ferry the soul across geographical realms.
These ships weren't just symbolic. They were packed for a long voyage. Warriors were interred with their best weapons, valuable livestock, and even sacrificed servants to ensure their earthly status was successfully projected into the next life. This ritual was driven by a practical terror, the belief that if the rites weren't performed with precision, the spirit would return as a restless ghost to haunt the living. These elaborate burials were a final, meticulous protocol, a way for humans to exert a sense of order and manufactured legacy over the grave's silence. A knight's flower-coated bouquet, a Venetian's black velvet mask, a samurai's traditional sword, and a Viking's buried ship. These four cultures share no geography and were separated by centuries. Yet their responses to extreme pressure follow a strikingly similar pattern. Human beings cannot tolerate a vacuum of meaning. When our environments become unpredictable or unsurvivable, we invent rigid structures and elaborate rituals to regain our sense of agency. Historical rituals and honor codes are the enduring blueprints of resilience. They remind us that while the threats we face change, the way we survive them remains the same. History is traditionally taught through the lens of power, kings, conquests, and the shifting of borders. But for the vast majority of our ancestors, the defining struggle of their lives wasn't a battle for a throne. It was the grueling, mundane effort of surviving until sunset on a Tuesday. Humans possess a curious biological drive. Even when we are surrounded by plague, famine, or freezing winters, we still seek out recreation. We have an innate need to create culture and play games, even when the environment is actively trying to kill us. To understand how different eras solved this paradox, we can map this tension along a spectrum. We'll look at three distinct societies: Tudor England, the medieval Silk Road, and the Viking North. Examining how a civilization spends its incredibly scarce free time reveals its true nature. Their choice of play tells us exactly how they viewed the heavy burden of staying alive. In 16th century Tudor Britain, daily life was physically grueling and deeply unsanitary. The morning ritual often involved emptying a chamber pot directly out of a window, splashing waste onto rat-infested cobblestones below. With no plumbing and a total ignorance of bacteria, the average citizen lived in a constant state of biological vulnerability. This environment was enforced by a rigid social hierarchy. While the commoner struggled in the mud, the monarchy lived in heavily padded opulence, using gold and jewel-encrusted fabrics to signal their absolute distance from the poverty of the streets. This extreme social pressure made healthy recreation impossible. Instead of providing an escape from the harshness of reality, Tudor leisure time became a mirror of it. Their most popular pastimes were built on brutality. Families gathered for public executions as if they were theater, and spent their coin at bear baitings, where chained animals were torn apart by dogs for sport. In Tudor society, the struggle for survival was so suffocating that joy couldn't find its own space. Because they couldn't escape their reality, their play simply replicated it. On the medieval Silk Road, the threats to survival were equally lethal, but they came from the landscape. Merchants had to endure vast deserts, freezing mountains,
and the ever-present danger of professional bandit raids. The Seljuk Empire addressed these threats with high-level engineering. They constructed stone fortresses called caravanserai, exactly 1 day's journey apart. These weren't just inns. They were military-grade shelters designed to keep the chaos of the Silk Road outside their walls. Once a traveler crossed the threshold and the gates were barred, survival was effectively guaranteed by the state. This engineering created an internal sanctuary where a merchant could finally prioritize rest over defense. Inside this protected vacuum, a massive cultural exchange occurred. People from vastly different worlds shared food, stories, and art in a courtyard that was physically shielded from the surrounding violence. This safety allowed music to cross borders and transform. The Persian oud journeyed eastward, where its design and string techniques fused into the Chinese pipa. Instruments were no longer local curiosities. They became the common language of the Silk Road. The caravanserai functioned as a literal shield for culture. It proves that when a society builds a reliable barrier against environmental threats, human recreation and innovation are given the space to thrive. In the Viking North, the environment itself was the primary adversary. The harsh Scandinavian winters and the constant demands of maritime warfare created a landscape where survival and threat were permanently intertwined. Life in the north left no margin for error. Weakness meant a swift death, and the community had zero patience for idle pastimes that didn't contribute to the group's strength. Their solution was to hide survival training inside their games. They favored Nefertafel, a board game that simulates a king trying to escape a surrounding force of attackers. To win, a player had to use tactical forethought to evade capture and reach the safety of the corners. This wasn't a distraction, it was a mental exercise in the exact strategic thinking required for successful ship raids. Physical sports followed the exact same logic. Grappling in the snow or racing across freezing rivers built the high-impact resilience and physical readiness necessary for close-quarters combat. The Vikings didn't try to separate leisure from survival. Instead, they weaponized their play, turning the very skills needed to stay alive into their most valued cultural activity.
These three historical strategies represent the different ways humans solved the survival puzzle: by mirroring the brutality, engineering a shield against it, or turning it into a game. The failure of the Tudor era proved that recreation cannot flourish in filth. The extreme squalor that infected their leisure time eventually made the mastery of sanitation and public health a biological necessity for any society that wanted to grow. The caravanserai acted as a biological incubator for ideas. By protecting the Persian oud and allowing it to reach Europe as the lute, these walls safeguarded the specific fret and string DNA that evolved into the modern guitar. And the Viking tradition of turning environmental survival into a contest established the very concept of athletic endurance, a legacy that still drives modern competitive sports and the Olympic Games. A civilization's lasting mark isn't just about the wars it won. It's about how it managed the burden of existence and how it uniquely balanced the cold requirement of staying alive with the enduring human spirit of play.